Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football, the first official defensive coordinator hot board for this Florida State program. Now, we just finished up on the offensive side of the football. Now we're moving to the defensive coordinator spot. I'm going to start off with the same conversation we did for the offensive coordinator, and that is what are we looking for in a defensive coordinator? Now, for the offensive side of the football, I think the number one thing you're looking for is a proven play caller that knows how to scheme up an offense and develop quarterbacks. You can overcome a talent gap if you can coach quarterbacks well and scheme up an offense. On the defensive side of the football, it's much harder to overcome talent gaps. You look at the best defenses in the country year after year, it normally correlates pretty damn closely with what teams are the best recruiting defensive players. Like, there's a reason Kirby Smart's a great defensive mind. Don't get me wrong. The reason Georgia is the best defense in the country almost every single year is because they recruit those kind of guys. So when you're talking about a defensive coordinator hire, I think it's much more important to have that emphasis on the recruiting trail. And quite frankly, I think Mike Norvell sees this is kind of why Florida State's bottom kind of fell out. They just haven't been recruiting good enough. They haven't been developing players. You missed in the transfer portal. That would cause you to lose maybe a couple of games. But the reason we're seeing this Florida State team really, really struggle in 2025 is they didn't have guys from the high school ranks that could replace all that lost production. And that's why we've seen the bottom fall out. So I think there's a heavier emphasis on the recruiting trail when we're talking about defensive candidates. Fired up to get into the list. Now, before we do, and as always, I think most importantly, Florida State fans, and we said this for the offensive coordinators, we're going to be having a lot of conversations about Florida State over the next couple of weeks, not only with the coaching staff, but with personnel as well. There's going to be a lot of change within this Florida State program, and I don't think change is bad for Florida State. Like, you want to shake some things up over the next couple of weeks and months. It's going to be a really exciting next couple of weeks. Appreciate you guys rocking with it. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Without further ado, let's get into this. I want to start with he's my 1-1 for Florida State, and I don't think you'll see this on a lot of hot boards, on message boards. Tim Walton at Ohio State. Big time connections to the state of Florida. But most importantly, there's probably not a better recruiter in the country on the defensive side of the football than Tim Walton. Now, Tim Walton's not a defensive backs coach who hasn't had experience calling plays. He's been all over the state of Florida with the Miami Hurricanes, coaching and calling defense. So, one, connections to the state of Florida, which I think is going to be really, really important. Like, you look at Florida State and say there's no excuse for Florida State taking a backseat to anybody when it comes to recruiting the state of Florida. That needs to be a really, really strong emphasis for Mike Norvell. I think Tim Walton certainly could do that. And I think more importantly, he's a really good developer of talent too. Now, he's not necessarily the track record, I should say, is not necessarily the best when you talk about a defensive coordinator. He's not had a ton of success, but he's had a ton of success on the recruiting trail. And that's where it starts. Like, if Florida State can hire Tim Walton and they start bringing in legitimate dudes from the high school ranks year after year, there's no doubt in my mind that this Florida State team will be a very good defense. And you look at the defensive back room for Ohio State and say, yeah, he's recruited well, but every single guy in this Ohio State defensive back room is going to get drafted to the NFL over the next couple of years. It's one of the best units that you see in the country. So Tim Walton, proven recruiter with ties to the state of Florida and a proven player developer. I think that makes a lot of sense if you are Florida State. And you look at Pat Surtain and Tim Walton, like tag teaming, recruiting a defensive backfield, it doesn't get much better for Florida State on the recruiting trail than Tim Walton. Next guy I want to talk about, and a guy that I think people just kind of forget he exists, Zach Arnett. 2 years ago, Zach Arnett was the hottest name in the country in terms of defensive coordinator candidates. Takes the Mississippi State head coach job, does not do a very good job. Now he's an analyst at Ole Miss. Now, I'll say this, Ole Miss's defense is legit this year. It's one of the best units in the country. I'm not sure the role Zach Arnett has in that. People shouldn't forget, how good of a pure defensive coordinator Zach Arnett was, not only at Mississippi State, but also at San Diego State. I think Zach Arnett would be a great candidate in terms of he's a free agent, essentially. I think he clearly take this job at Florida State. And man, he has such a strong background and track record of being a really good defensive coordinator. I think most importantly, at Mississippi State, he's not exactly the most elite recruiter, but man, did he maximize the talent at Mississippi State. And I think he'd do the same thing at Florida State. Next name, and a name that I'm not sure how realistic it is. Defensive coordinator Jim Leonhard obviously kind of made his name at Wisconsin. Was an analyst for Illinois last year. Is working with the defensive backs for the Denver Broncos in 2024. Look, I don't know if Jim Leonhard has a desire to come back to college coaching, but if he does, he should be one of the first names on the call list for Mike Norvell. There's not many proven better defensive coordinators than Jim Leonhard, and I love when coaches go to the NFL and then come back to college. There's such a strong track record, especially on the defensive side of the football, for coaches that were in the NFL coming back to college and having a lot of success. Dan Lynn at USC is one of them. Jesse Minter and Mike McDonald at Michigan, another set of those. There's been a strong list of evidence that suggests that coaches that spent time in the NFL on defense come back to college, have a lot of success. And Jim Leonhard, a guy that's played in the NFL, recruited well at Wisconsin. That's a hard place to recruit at an extremely high level. I think he'd recruit just fine, if not really well, at Florida State. Last name on the list, Derek Nicholson at Miami. Now, this one 3-4 weeks ago would have loved it. The Miami struggled on defense. The linebackers have struggled the last couple of weeks. Florida State alum would recruit at an extremely high level. That's kind of the difference between what we've seen with Miami and Florida State. Mario Cristobal has hired just dogs on the recruiting trail, guys that have a strong emphasis and work their tails off recruiting. Derek Nicholson is one of them. There's a long list of guys from the state of Florida that he has committed and playing for the Miami Hurricanes. You want that if you're Mike Norvell at Florida State. And again, going back to what's most important, you got to get the dudes into this program on the defensive side of the football. Now, not a proven play caller, not even he's probably a proven developer of talent. I don't think Miami's necessarily played great on defense, so I think you have second guesses and questions about Derek Nicholson as an actual football coach, but would recruit really well. Florida State alum, knows the state, knows how to get talent there. That one would make a lot of sense too. I think a lot of Florida State fans would be relatively excited about Derek Nicholson coming to Florida State. And again, I think other names to keep an eye on, like Mark Stoops at Kentucky, real chance that he gets fired. Would he want to be a defensive coordinator at Florida State? Dave Aranda at Baylor, I think a very similar conversation. I've seen Brent Venables at Oklahoma. I'd be surprised if Brent Venables loses his job. And I think secondly, I'd be surprised if he came to Florida State. But there are some names that are currently head coaches that might not be head coaches in a month that Florida State might be interested in. And again, if I'm Mike Norvell, I am looking to the NFL ranks as well. There's a strong track record, guys coming from the NFL, being really good defensive coordinators in college. We'll see where Mike Norvell decides to go. Again, strong emphasis on the recruiting trail. I think that is really important. When you want a good defense, you got to get NFL dudes. You got to get NFL dudes out of the high school ranks. We'll see where Mike Norvell decides to go. We'll wrap it up there. Appreciate you guys rocking with it again. Let it fly in the comment section. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel, and we'll talk to y'all later.